Let me pray. Lord, we thank you for this day. We're just glad to get the time it's spent in your word and help us to understand how it all fits together, how we can apply it, how we can see these things as an example for us, Lord, to learn from them. And I pray you'll bless this time in Jesus' name. Amen. So we are in Joshua, and the book of Joshua is about how God leads the people into the land. It is the natural transition from the first 5 books of the Bible, and especially you can see the continuity from Deuteronomy as that transition of power is taking place on Moses' side. Moses, you can't go into the land. You're going to look at it from this mountain, and then you're going to die. And then Joshua's going to take over, right? The moment you get into Joshua, the first words that the Lord says to him is, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now it's on you, right? You're going to lead the people. And this verse is a part of it. He says, you need to remember not to depart from the book of the law. It's your basis for being in the land and establishing yourself in the land, of which Deuteronomy is all about. You're going to have to attach yourself to it so that you may be careful to do all that is written according to it, and that you may prosper in the land, right, and have success. So these ideas are directly connected with what comes before it, right? The Bible is not a disconnected series of books, but very, in the context, very connected and very understandable. You have no problem reading Deuteronomy and understanding where you get to in Joshua. And so Joshua is all about entering into the land. And so there is some historical recounting from Joshua as they get ready to go in the land. We'll look at the big outline there. The preparation of Israel for the conquest, right? So you have these kind of things that take place at Jericho and Ai, a good example and a bad example about how it can go as you go into the land, right? Jericho is the good example about how it can go. If you follow the Lord like you did at Jericho, that's how it's going to go for you. The Lord is going to go before you. He's going to fight the battles before you even get there, and you're going to win and have success because He's going to do the heavy lifting. If you don't follow Him, you're going to go into Ai, where they said, we don't need that many people, we can just send a few thousand in, and they begin to get picked off before they even get to the gates, and they have to run away with little chickens, because God is not with them, and they were easy targets. And so they have both of those lessons that exist in the preparation for going into the land, right? And then Joshua takes the time to teach and instructs, and it says that he goes in and he repeats the whole book of the law for them and reminds them after Ai that we can't go anywhere. Here's another time we're going to take the time to teach and instruct, recommit ourselves to following God's covenant. This covenant promise is attached, the blessings and the cursings about how it's going to go. So he teaches, and it says he didn't leave one thing out. He went through every detail for them. And so that takes place in the preparation section of the first 5 books, which we made it through last week. We ended kind of in the middle of the conquest of Canaan by Israel. And so they begin to make their way into the land. And I'll summarize that. I think I can pick up in chapter 10 is where we're going to pick up at. But from chapter 6 through chapter 10, you have this whole series of events that seem kind of random at first, but then you see how God puts it all together, right? You get the hearing of these kings and these 5 kings, 5 powerful nations that they would have to go into. And the Lord says, they're a lot bigger and mightier than you, right? Look at them, because they're strong. You couldn't fight them without me. And God says, just watch how it all works out, right? He says, they're going to have this great idea. They're going to think it's their idea. It's this great idea. Boy, we can't fight them one-on-one. We know that won't work. So let's all get together and fight Israel together. 5 powerful nations together. We got a good shot at winning, right? We're going to win. It just makes it easier for God to pick them all off. So let's all get together in one place where God can destroy us all at once. God says, yep, that's exactly what He's going to do, right? So it takes place through those chapters where all these God causes, Then the third piece that falls in the line is He says, before we go fight Israel, here's their brainiac idea. We should pick the Gibeonites off because they're pretty strong. And if they're helping Israel, that just makes it harder. Let's pick Gibeonites off first before we go to Israel. God reminds them about the lesson about making peace treaties with people. You don't want to do that without praying, because now you're responsible for these poor Gibeonites who are about to be destroyed. You need to go in and help them. And so they realize that this treaty that they made puts them into a state of responsibility for the Gibeonites. So God says, don't worry about it, it's all part of my plan, but because you made this treaty, you have to go help those people. That's how it works, right? You don't get to shuck your responsibility off here. Watch what happens. You get to get involved. So they do. And they're winning the battle until the point where they're running and picking them all off. And they say, God, we need a little extra time. And so the sun stands still. And God allows them to have this extra daylight of a full almost day, right? To allow them to finish the battle, if you will. And that takes place all the way up into this conquest of Canaan. It's the beginning of all the conquest of Canaan. Let me get to my navigator here, and I think it kind of right here. And to the point where the 5 kings who have been defeated hid in a cave. That's kind of where we ended, I think. And they rolled the stone over the mouth of the cave and said, let's go pick the army off and come back and deal with these guys, right? And they do so. And they go until, as it says in verse 20-21, they went until this very great slaughter, and they were all destroyed. And the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, so that all the people returned to the camp of Joshua in peace, right? Now, no one's going to say a word. They're all like, wow, this all worked out amazing, right? We got nothing to say. And it says they bring the kings out, right? And they slaughter these kings as a sign, and they set up this cave as a memorial. So that's what they do. And I think the summary fits well in chapter 10 and verse 42. And that's kind of what, if you want to understand this conquest of Israel by the people and what God did, in verse 42 it says, and thus Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because Yahweh, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. And so Joshua and all of Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal, right? And so that's kind of the progress that takes place up until this, where we left off, right? Instead of having to go to this long campaign of 5 different nations and fight them one at a time, God says, now, I'm just going to give you one extra day of sunlight and we're going to take care of it all at once. So the battle and the length of the battle and, the days and weeks that they chase these guys around, they get it all done at once instead of having to fight one and then move to the next one and fight the next one and move to the next one and fight. And it kind of essentially, on the west side of the Jordan, it breaks the back of all the military strength of the nations who are before them, right? It takes out the largest strategic group of kings and armies in the land to say, well, what's left, they're never going to get together and be able to, they're never going to mass their armies together now and fight us. We just broke the back of the whole kind of military might of the land of Canaan on the west side of the Jordan. It's done. Okay. What happens later is just kind of now a cleanup operation. And now as the battles, and it's going to take years, right? So what takes place in all of this is, we'll go back to it, but then I can come back here, is that the time of the battle of these lands of Canaan, this is a 7-year battle, 7 years of fighting and warfare that take place from chapter 6 through chapter 13. Chapter 6 through 10 is probably a series of months, maybe a year, but probably months to fight the battle of these 5 kings, right, as they're chasing them all down and coming back to the kings, and, all of that takes place, even with the extra daylight. It's a 7-year battle to get to the end of chapter 13. We're not quite there, but we're getting there. So what takes place in the cleanup operation is a series of years to get to those 7 years. That's kind of the recap. So that's where we end up in Joshua chapter 11. And so when you get to Joshua chapter 11, you get to the next stage of the battle, and it says, now it happened when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard about all of these things, that he sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and the king of Shepah, And so the kings who were of the north and the hill country and in the Arabah, the south, those are geographic terms, in the Chinneroth and in the Shephelah, another geographic rolling hills. These guys are to the west, to the Canaanite of the east, the Amorite and the Hittite, Perizzite, Jebusite. It says they're naming all the remaining groups that need to be dealt with. They came out, and they and all their armies with them, as many as the sand of the sea and the seashore. It says they all came out and they agreed to meet, and now they're going to take their shot at it. And so in chapter 6, Yahweh said to Joshua, or chapter 11, verse 6, Yahweh said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give all of them over, slain, before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war came out upon them suddenly by the waters of Memram, and they fell upon them, and Yahweh gave them into the hand of Israel, so that they struck them down and pursued them as far as the great Sidon and Misrephoth and all the wonderful names you got to learn to pronounce, right? The valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them there until there was no survivor remaining for them. And Joshua did to them just as Yahweh said to them. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. So you have this, again, the remaining powers that are, remaining in Israel are kind of defeated all in this great battle. And so it says that Joshua in verse 10 would turn back at that time and capture Hazor and struck the king with a sword. And for Hazor was formerly the head of all these kingdoms. And they struck every person who was within the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire. And he captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings. And he struck them with the edge of the sword and devoted them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had commanded. So you have this cleanup battle that takes place as a part, once they see that the great 5 kingdoms were defeated, the remaining power gathers together, and Yahweh allows Joshua to defeat them from the north and the south and the east and the west, right? And so they're able to do that, and they devote them to destruction up through verse 12. It says in verse 13, however, Israel did not burn any of the cities which stood on their mounds except Hazor alone. The spoil of these cities, the cattle, the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one remaining who breathed, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses his servant. So Moses had commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that Yahweh had commanded Moses. So you have this kind of a summary statement that's made about these battles that take place. There we go. And he's able to capture and to destroy and to do everything that had commanded Moses. Let me catch up on my slides. But chapter 11 gives that cleanup of the battle that takes place. And again, what you get out of all of this is that it says everything that Moses was commanded, that was passed down to Joshua, Joshua did it. And he followed the instructions of the Lord. And so he has these kind of successes in their battles. That's up through chapter 11. And, okay. I don't know if the batteries today are just just not going to be a technology day for me. There we go. It says in all that in verse 19, if you continue reading there, part of it says there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. So the Gibeonites had already made peace, and these neighboring Hivites said, that sounds like a great idea to me. Right? There were some groups they were allowed to make peace with, and so this is the group. This is the only one that it identifies as having taken advantage of that. And the reason why, it says it was of Yahweh to strengthen their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might devote them to destruction. So why did no other group make peace? God put it in their hearts not to. So it's of God's hand. It's divine hand that only the Hivites and the Gibeonites of all the groups in the land have made peace with them. God's mind was to devote them to destruction, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And so you have that plan that, again, Joshua is following, and it says in verse 23, "So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Yahweh had spoken to Moses and to Joshua for an inheritance, to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. The land was then quiet from war." So you have this break or respite in the war in chapter 11, and it talks about, this is the pause. Chapter 12 is pretty much a documentation of history. Who were these kings? Who were all the people? What were the names of the, I'm not going to embarrass myself and read all those names. That would take practice. So, but it's a part of a recount of the battles. Chapter 12 is a recounting of the things that took place up through chapter 11. And so you get to see and read the names. One of the things about Joshua that's pretty neat, if you study geography at all, the borders of the land of Israel are not in any way unclear. They're very clear and detailed. And so you get, especially when you get into the dividing of the land for the tribes in the later chapters, you'll hear names like Gaza and other ones that you'll hear in the news. And you'll go, oh, they existed back then, and that was a part of Israel. And right, which tribe, had that land allotted to them. You can know that it was a part of Judah, or etc., right? So a lot of that, the very benefit of Joshua is that in no way is it an ancient text that is not clear or understandable. If you read this, there's no question. You could go to Israel today, modern cities, modern boundaries, whatever, you can understand the boundaries that Israel is given for their land. It's not unclear even today. So it doesn't mean they get it today. God is not giving it to them today. But in this time, they had the borders established very clear. And in the future, those borders will make sense. Even though there's conflict today. That's a part of God's design. So, chapter 13, as you get into it, it really declares the end of the wars in this way. Joshua is now old and advanced in years. So Yahweh said to him, "You are now old." It's always good when God confirms that to you. Hopefully God doesn't come to us and say, "You know what, you're old, Dave." But he might. He says, "You're advanced in years, and very much of the land remains to be possessed." Okay, so a summary from chapter 11 says this. Well, Joshua did everything that God wanted him to do. But then you go to chapter 13, and it says, "Yeah, but you're old, and there's still a lot left to be done." Well, which one is it? It's both. He did conquer and break the back militarily and strategically of all the armies in the area. But that doesn't mean all the people groups and towns and cities and villages and some leftovers, even militarily. They got some strength, right? But in the big picture, it's all done. You just got to know that it's not 100% clear. Not all the people groups are gone. They're still there. You defeated their armies, but their people are still there. And there's a lot of towns and villages. They didn't go into every town and village and clear them out yet. And so chapter 13 is what he talks about. But now it doesn't matter, because the military might is gone. And so he says in verse 7, "So apportion this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh." So you have the 9.5 tribes on the west side of the Jordan River. They're going to have their land divided up. The east of the Jordan River, they've kind of already done that. They divided it up. They settled it. Remember, they have to go fight with their brothers before they go home. Right? And so now he says for the 9.5 tribes, it's time to divide that all up. And so that's what takes place. Yay. I'm going to have to start using the keyboard. All right. And so it says, with the other half tribe, the Reubenites and Gadites received their inheritance, which Moses gave them beyond the Jordan to the east, just as Moses, the Lord, servant of the Lord, sent them. They get to go home. Right? So the tribes east of the Jordan go home. Tribes west of the Jordan, it's time to do some work in dividing up the land. And for the Levites, we don't forget them. Right? The Levites are the priestly tribe. They do not get division in the land. They don't get a section of land that's for them. They get cities and fields in each of the other tribes' land. So they're going to be spread out throughout the land. This is kind of like, this is their church planting operation. It's not just in Jerusalem with the temple, but the priests are sent into every tribe's area to have cities for themselves and fields to provide for them. But they're going to perform the priestly function. They're going to minister to the people as a part of their calling of God. And so they don't get one land. They get a little bit of everybody's land. And they're going to go and live among the other tribes as ministers to them. And so the Levites do that. They did not get an inheritance, the offerings of fire by fire of the Lord, the God of Israel, as there are their inheritance, as He spoke to them. But they will get cities in each of the people's lands. And that's for their benefit, right? Now we have priestly people in our lands to minister to us, and that's a good thing. God had a good plan in that. So they go back from chapter 13, verse 8, chapter 13 to the end, verse 33. And then you see how these lands that remain to be possessed and how they're going to divide them up. The plan is laid in verse 13. Now is the time to go do it. Chapter 14, you get into the next section is the settlement. How do they do it in the west side? You go back to the west side of the Jordan, the big side. And it says, these are the territories of the sons of Israel, that the sons of Israel inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the households of the tribes of the sons of Israel apportioned to them for an inheritance. Right? How did they do it? It says they did it by lot. It says by the lot of their inheritance, as Yahweh commanded. So how do they know which one's going where? Pull your name out of a hat. Then we get to figure out where you're going. A lot of it is divided up and just kind of randomly, but God decides the lots. You pull your name out, this is where your land is going to be, right? There's not a lot of choosing in it. Few people get to choose, though. Just not everybody. Verse 14, verse 4, why the division of the land in a certain way? Remember that Joseph gets 2 portions of land, right? The Levites don't get one, but Joseph gets 2. That's why you end up with 12 still. And you get Manasseh and Ephraim divided up, and they give a portion to the Levites' land, right? So you have both tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, get an allotment. In verse 4, they did just as the Lord had commanded them, and they divided the land. Then you get Caleb, who is specially called out in chapter 14, verse 6. Remember him? Why does he get special treatment? You remember?
He was a good spy.
He was a good spy, so now his reward, right? So now it says there in verse 6, the sons of Judah drew near to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, he came to him. You know the word which Yahweh spoke to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea, telling Joshua, you remember, you were there. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of Yahweh, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought word back to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear, but I followed Yahweh my God fully. So that in verse 9, Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden it will be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed Yahweh my God fully. So he's reminding them about this, and of course he gets his way. He gets the area around Kadesh Barnea where you went out and gave a good report. It's yours, buddy. God promised it to you. It's not picked by lot or random. No, God made a promise. Nobody gets that land. It's yours. Caleb gets it. And so that's a part of the history of establishing the land. And so you kind of have all this inheritance divided up, and you can see all the borders. Again, from chapters 14 and 15, you get all the border of Judah, all the description of their land, all the tribes, where they divided up. I'm not going to read it through. But part of the difficulty, and here's just a reminder to help you get into Judges, right? When you get into Judges, you get these reminders, but Joshua gives them too. Says, yeah, but for the Jebusites in the land of Judah, that they were dividing up around Jerusalem, they were the tribe around Jerusalem, says they could not drive out the Jebusites before them, so the Jebusites lived with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until it is this day. So at the time of establishing the land, Jerusalem was not the capital of Israel. It was not where they established anything. They hadn't taken it yet, and it was still in the hands of the Jebusites. That happens a little later. So, but that's just, you get those things. Not everybody is gone, right? Just the reminders. When you get into chapter 16, you get into Ephraim and the account of Ephraim, right? Then the lot for the sons of Joseph went out for the Jordan at Jericho, to the waters of Jericho in the east, into the wilderness, going up from Jericho through the hill country to Bethel. And it begins to describe all of that, right? And it says, in this way, the sons, in verse 4, this is the way in which the sons of Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim received their inheritance. It was the territory of the sons of Ephraim according to their families, and it begins to divide and just give description for how they went in and divided up the lands for Ephraim and Manasseh. They did not, however, in verse 10, drive out everybody. It says they did not dispossess the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. And so the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and they became forced laborers. And so you have groups of people who are left in the land. And chapter 17, the lot for Manasseh. He was the firstborn of Joseph. It describes that. But in verse 12 of chapter 17, it says the sons of Manasseh could not take possession of these cities because the Canaanites persisted in the land. Right? And so you have all of this description about how the land was divided up and some of the groups remaining. And it just reminds you, there are people left in the land. But it says in verse 13 there, it did happen that when the sons of Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not dispossess them completely. So just a reminder that when you get to Judges and God's able to use these people as judges against Israel, as discipline against Israel, they're still there. They were not removed. Some of these groups are going to come back and haunt them. And for good reason. And so you have all this description of the division of the land, right? Chapter 18, it goes on and it says, this is the remaining tribes that came out. There remained among the sons of Israel tribes who had not divided their inheritance. Joshua has to remind them, get going. What are you waiting for? God gave it to you. Are you waiting for an invitation? Right? Get out there and do what you were supposed to do. Right? Joshua said to them, how long will you put off entering the possession of the land which the Lord gave your fathers? Right? So then he says, here's the plan. Right? In verse 4, or is it verse 4? Yep. And provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe that I may send them, that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it, according to their inheritance. Then they're going to return. Then we shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall stay in its territory to the south, and the house of Joseph shall stay in its territory to the north. In a sense, we're going to divide everything in the middle. You shall write a description of the land in 7 divisions and bring it to me, and then I will cast lots for you here before Yahweh our God. So the remaining tribes, they're going to have a lottery for the land, random choice, but God's choice, right? They just have to trust that God is going to define for them their land by these casting of the lots. We're going to trust that. We're going to believe God's going to tell us where we get to live. It's not going to be anybody's choice because it's random by our side. No influence there. But God will choose. So that's how they divide up the land in chapter 18. And in verse 10, it gives this description. The south side belonged to Ephraim, the north side to Manasseh. The sea was at their border. This is a description of how they divided up the land of Ephraim and Manasseh. It includes, I don't know if it's here or later, but it includes, remember, there was a promise made in Leviticus to the daughters of Joseph as well, that they get a portion of their land, that they weren't left out because they didn't have, a portion of this. So this is the one instance where daughters get their division of the land with Ephraim and Manasseh. And I think it's here, maybe it's a little later, but just trying to place it in my head what chapter it's in, but it's in there. We'll get to it. So chapter 19, the sons of Simeon, they get their portion, and here, when they're dividing it up and they're looking at the amount of land, it says, interestingly enough, some of it was taken from the portion of the sons of Judah, where the sons of Judah was just too large. Right? Now, you can't have all that. It's kind of an inequity there. There's a little bit too much of an advantage. So some of it for Simeon was given back. Just a realization there that as they were dividing up the land, some of this wisdom had to be applied and thought through that said, you know what, we got to make this as fair as we can. Right? This division of the land. So they have to understand it, and they get it kind of in the midst of Judah's inheritance. So they get this probably beneficial land, good crop land, some way it was beneficial to have this. They take a good portion that's not, you don't get the rocky, crummy stuff. I think the reason they kind of describe it's in the middle, because they said you get some of the good stuff.
Yeah, it never sunk in why they divided by lot, but knowing people's human nature about being jealous about, and you got better stuff than I did.
Yep.
Now they can't really say, there was favoritism in the division. It was because
Correct.
They all knew that God was, they pulled a number out of the hat, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's what you got.
Yeah. I think that's the very thing. It's just, we're going to let God choose. It's not, I gave you a little bit of a bribe and I got the good land, or no influence, or hey, we've been buddies forever, you know what to do when the time comes, right? And none of that.
Yeah.
So they removed that from the equation, and I think that was good of them to do. I think it was their wisdom of just saying, we got to let God choose this, or we'll end up bickering, right? So I think there is some of that. Any other questions?
Just a comment. You were talking about the women getting the partial. It's chapter 17, verse 3.
Thank you. There it is.
The only reason why I remember is because one of the ladies was named Noah.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, feel free to name your daughters Noah. I can't argue against it. So
we have a granddaughter named Noah.
There you go.
Without the H, though.
Okay. Yeah. Is there a Chinese root for that, or is it?
No.
Okay. Well, we'll just claim biblical authority on that one. All right. Yeah.
I have a question, and I think you might have covered this previously, but in Revelation, like when they named the tribes, like Dan isn't included, and then I don't think that Ephraim. And can you remind me why that is?
Yeah, I'll pick it out in the history books coming up, but they rebel.
Oh.
And they get judged for their rebellion, and so their names are removed.
Both of those groups?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then is this the same land that originally Joseph's brothers came from to go to Egypt?
Yes.
So I guess, because they left partly because of famine, how did all these people groups still survive that?
Well, so part of it is, we're talking 400 years later. They had time to recover, right?
Okay.
And just like Joseph was able to go in with 70-some people and come out 2.5 million people, in 400 years, these people had a chance to recover. Part of the history is that it indicates that even with Abraham's time in the land, they knew about the God of Abraham and they did not listen. And so their wickedness had grown to the point where God said it's time to judge them and remove them from the land. Because it's not about how good you are, Israel, remember. It's about how wicked they've been while you've been gone. And they didn't listen. And so, these groups were always in the land. They were always numerous. They were, with the time of Abraham, he lived as a sojourner and a tent dweller. He didn't live like a person who owned the land. He only bought a few little pieces of land around a spring of water and a place to bury his wife and, a few things. Otherwise, he kind of just lived as a tent dweller and a moving around the land. But God said, look around, and he gave certain borders, but not as detailed as you get in Joshua. Joshua is probably the most detailed account of the land and the borders that they have in the biblical history.
I just have one more question. I don't know if you know this or if it's in the Bible anywhere, but is there a reason why the Levites were chosen to be the priestly tribe?
Yeah, because of their connection to Aaron. and the Aaronic priesthood of the tribe of Levi. And so it comes out, because Aaron was from the tribe of Levi, that the Aaronic priesthood is attached to that tribe, and that's why.
So it wasn't originally that the Levites were set apart, it started with Aaron.
In that time frame when the priesthood was established.
But didn't they also, when they had the golden calf, they were the ones that went through and started
killing everybody. Killing everybody. Yeah, they executed the judgment on that one, and they did.
At that point,
that's where the families get divided up. Like there's certain families that are in the priestly, like the high priestly, and certain families that are in the, the villages and towns priesthood. Some of that, when you see the land divided up and certain families go into certain tribes areas, that's also how they divide up the tribe of Levi by families, right? Some of them have attachment to the high priesthood. Some of them have attachment to the normal priesthood. So that even by the time of Christ and Luke, when you have Elizabeth and names Zacharias, that he's in one of those tribes who lives out in a certain hill country, and he comes in only a certain calendar part of the year to come in and do his priestly duties, because he's from those normal tribes, the normal priestly tribes. And so they travel in from the cities that were allotted to them, in that way, in the priestly function. So, that's a little bit about how the priestly function. But yeah. So let's try to finish up today. I've only got a few more chapters to go through. But so the inheritance of the sons of Simeon, just an interesting thing. I mean, they did pursue fairness in that. I think that's just something I was calling out there, that, it just says that that doesn't say God made them do it. It looks more like they just kind of decided from a sense of fairness. And then you get the inheritance in chapter 19 in verse 48, the end of it, the last tribe, Dan there. This was the inheritance of the tribes of Dan. And it says, let me get there. Yeah, and the tribes of Dan according to their families and the cities with their villages. They go through all of Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, then Naphtali and Dan at the end to finish them up, right? And then verse 49 is the summary. It says, they finished apportioning the land for inheritance by its borders. Then the sons of Israel gave an inheritance in their midst to Joshua, the son of Nun. So he gets his last, after everything is all done, after everything has been established. Joshua gets it last. In accordance with the command of Yahweh, they gave him the city for which he had asked, Timerath Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. So they built the city and settled it. And it says in verse 51, these are the inheritances which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the households of the tribes of the son of Israel distributed by lot in Shiloh before Yahweh at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So they finished dividing the land. So that's how all the land was divided. Now chapter 20 comes in, and the reason that's important is because it begins to divide chapter 20 and 21. They divide up the priestly land. They tell them which cities they get. And so you get chapter 20 and verse 1, where it describes that one of the important aspects of their living as a nation before the Lord is that part of their government actions, if you will, was this. It says in verse 2, Yahweh spoke to Joshua saying, verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel saying, it's time to designate the cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you by the hand of Moses, so that the manslayer who strikes down any person unintentionally without premeditation may flee there. And they shall become for you as a refuge from the avenger of blood. Right? So if it was an accidental death, the family may still want to enact justice on this. The way you can save yourself is you run to this city of refuge. And then you'll have to live there. There's rules about that, right? Until the priest dies or the family, there's ways in which you can get out of it. But it's kind of like your prison sentence. You're going to live in isolation in these cities of refuge, away from your families, but in safety from the avenging families for an accidental death. Right? And City of Refuge has that purpose. And so says in chapter 21, verse 1, that they apportioned all of those towns, right? The heads of the households of the Levites came near to Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun. And now they say in chapter 21, Yahweh commanded by the hand of Moses to give us the cities to live in with their pastures for our cattle. So the sons of Israel gave the Levites from their inheritance these cities with their pasture lands according to the command of Yahweh. And so again, by lot, it says, by lot came out the cities of the Kohathites, the sons of Aaron, right? So now, who were of the Levites, you get all the division of the land in chapter 21. Which families of the Levite tribes go where, into what tribe land? They get cities in every tribe. So, all that division takes place in chapter 21. So that in verse 43 it says, Yahweh gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give their fathers. And they possessed it. And they lived in it. And Yahweh gave them rest on every side according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And no one of all their enemies stood before them. Yahweh gave their enemies into their hand. Not one promise of the good promises which Yahweh had promised to the house of Israel failed. It all came to pass. And so, there your summary statement is just that they better remember that now that they're in the land, remember Deuteronomy, it goes, it's going to become up someday that when you're in the land, you're going to say, I did all this. You better remember that God did all this. God gave them peace on every land. Their enemies are still in their midst, but none of them can stand before them. A lot of them are in forced labor. But that won't last forever unless you continue to follow God, right? So remember who did all this. Remember who gave it all to you. Remember who turned and flipped the switch to make it a veritable garden that God waters and provides everything that you need for. So this is the summary of all of the division of the land. And so, you get to, it worked. This is their conditions for continued settlement in the land, starting in chapter 22. Now, part of it is, we're going to send those tribes. Remember the tribes who were on the east side of the Jordan, Reubenites, Gadites, half tribe of Manasseh. You guys did good. It says, Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites, the half tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, You have kept all that Moses, the servant of Yahweh, commanded you, and you have listened to my voice and all that I commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, to this day. But you have kept the responsibility of the commandments of Yahweh your God. And now, Yahweh your God has given rest to your brothers as he spoke to them. So now turn and go to your tents to the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of Yahweh, gave to you beyond the Jordan. Only keep yourselves very carefully to do the commandments of the law, right? So you got to remember, keep the commandments. Be very careful to observe all those things. And so Joshua blessed them in verse 6 and sent them on their way. That's kind of the summary of chapter 22. It only works sometimes. Okay. There we go. So now you get this chapter 22 and verse 10. As they're blessed and they're sent on their way, it looks like a problem arises. They came into the region of the land of Jonah in verse 10 of chapter 22, which is in the land of Canaan. The sons of Reuben, sons of Gad, half tribe of Manasseh, they built an altar there by the Jordan. A large altar in appearance. So nobody communicates, nobody talks to anybody. They build this altar and assumptions are made. And in verse 11, the sons of Israel heard it and said, Behold, the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh built an altar at the entrance of the land of Canaan, in the region of the Jordan, on the side belonging to the sons of Israel. And when the sons of Israel heard of it, and the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled together themselves at Shiloh to go up against them in war. We don't know why they built this altar, but let's go kill them all. Now they have some reasoning, but it's their knee-jerk reaction is this: it's got to be bad, right? So they get up and they assemble themselves, and they go out to assemble themselves against war. And in verse 16 it says, right? when they came to the sons of Reuben, thus says the whole congregation of Yahweh, what is this unfaithful act with which you have committed against the God of Israel, turning away from following Yahweh this day by building yourselves an altar to rebel against you? We just assume you're doing this to establish your own little kingdom east of the Jordan. You're going to do it your own way, and you're not listening to God. You're obviously falling away, right? What are you doing? So in verse 17, they go back like, okay, we got hit over the head with a pretty large hammer. Remember Baal, Peor? Remember the iniquity of Peor, too small a thing for us, from which we have not even cleansed ourselves to this day. We haven't even got done getting over the judgment of this one. And you're going to do this again? Right? Although there was a plague on the congregation of Israel, right? They had people die when things like this happen. We don't want to get judged because you're doing something stupid, is really what they come across as, right? And yet you are turning away this day from following Yahweh. Now it will be that if you rebel against Yahweh today, verse 18, He's going to be angry with the whole congregation. Just because you're east of the Jordan, God's going to hit us too. We will not escape this if you're acting corruptly. That's why we're here. They're really afraid that God's going to judge them. So, understandably that part of it, right? I get it. If they're thinking that you guys are acting unfaithfully, we need to stop this thing before we all get judged. That's their attitude about it, right? It's a knee-jerk reaction. It doesn't have all the information, but I get why they're doing what they're doing. You must, and then it says, right, in verse 18, He's going to be angry with the whole congregation. Then in verse 20, they said, well, remember Achan? Man, Achan didn't just die for his sin alone. His whole family ended up dying for that one. We don't want any more of that happening among us. We don't need that kind of judgment on our... we need to stop, right? So the sons of Reuben, and they answer in verse 21, they spoke to all the families of Israel. And then in verse 22 it says, the mighty one, God, Yahweh, the mighty one, God, Yahweh, He knows. And may Israel itself know, if it was in rebellion or in an unfaithful act against Yahweh, do not save us this day. You go ahead and judge us. Go ahead and wipe us out for your own sake. If we have built for ourselves an altar to turn away from following Yahweh, or to perform a burnt offering or a sacrifice or a peace offering on it, which God did not command, may Yahweh Himself require it. But truly we have done this thing out of concern, and for a reason, saying, in the time to come, some of our sons are going to say to our sons, your sons are going to say to our sons, what have you to do with Yahweh, the God of Israel? You guys are so far away over there on the east of the Jordan. Are you sure you're even connected to us anymore? Are you sure you're part of our nation? See, your sons on the west, who are all together, going to look at your distant tribes and go, we think you guys are too far distant. We don't think you follow Yahweh. We built this altar for a reason. So when that comes up, therefore we said, verse 26, let us build an altar not for burnt offering or for sacrifice. Rather it shall be a witness between us and you, between our generations after us, that we are to perform the service of Yahweh before Him with our burnt offerings and our sacrifices, with our peace offerings, so that your sons will not say to our sons in the time to come, you have no portion with Yahweh. Nope. It's a reminder that we need to go where God says and offer the appropriate sacrifice. We're not sacrificing on this altar. It's a connection to our covenant in the land to say, remember, we're connected still. And we're going to do what's right when the time comes. We got to travel to you guys, to the tent of meeting, in order to offer these sacrifices. We're going to have to come for the Passover. We're going to have to, right? But this is our reminder. Teach us that we're still connected. And believe me, in Judges, this whole problem of the East and the West is going to come up. It's going to be an issue. So they're trying to put that issue off and saying, no, we want this as a reminder that we're still connected. They say it's a good idea. And so they have that connection in verse 23. You have the teaching of Joshua. Right? He begins to say, it came about after many days that when the Lord had given rest to the land of Israel from their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old, advanced to years, that Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, their heads, their judges, their officers. I am old, advanced in years, and you have seen all that Yahweh has done. Right? So I have allotted to you everything that God wanted done. Verse 6, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you might not turn from it. Right? So this whole speech is to remind them again, for the 100th time, but so necessary in our lives, we need to rehearse. God is faithful. Do not turn away to the left or the right. Stay with the Lord. The warnings in verse 12, if you ever turn your back and cling to the rest of these nations which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you go along with them, and they with you, know with certainty that Yahweh your God will not continue to dispossess these nations before you. But they will, be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which Yahweh has given you. Remember that for Judges next week. Right? It's going to come up. Remember that for Revelation tonight. It's going to come up. But, so that's the warning that comes along about intermarrying, connecting with the world around them, not separating the way God had wanted them to. Joshua in verse 24, he gathers them together and their elders, and he presented themselves before God, and they reaffirmed this covenant. Right? He says, are you going to follow God? Yes, we're going to follow God. Right? The people answered in verse 16, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. 24:19, you will not be able to serve the Lord, for He is a holy God. Look, you understand this covenant thing is not perfect because you're going to sin. You will sin. And so he says, you will not be able to serve God, Yahweh, for He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and your sins. If you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign gods, then He will turn and do you harm. And He will consume you after He has done good to you. And the people said, no, but we will serve Yahweh. And so in 22 he says, you are witnesses against yourselves, that you have chosen for yourselves Yahweh to serve Him. And they said, we are witnesses. So he reminds them in verse 23, now put away your foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve Yahweh our God, and we will listen to His voice. Verse 25, so Joshua cut a covenant with them, with the people that day, and he made a statute and a judgment in Shechem. And he wrote these words of the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there as a witness of this reaffirmation of the covenant. And that's what he says in verse 27. Behold, the stone shall be for a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of Yahweh which He spoke to us. Thus it shall be a witness against you, lest you deny your God. And so they set this memorial to say, this is the reestablishing of the covenant now that we're in the land. And they reteach the law. And they reteach the reason why God has established them in the land. And then Joshua dies. And Eleazar the priest dies. And that closes out the book of Joshua. And I got 7 minutes to get into the service. All right. But next week we'll pick up with Judges, and we'll have a few weeks in the book of Judges, and then Ruth, and then we're going to reset, and we'll set some dates in the future for going into Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. That's a big chunk, so it's not going to go fast, but we'll try to make it understandable in sense of chronology. We're going to spend some time trying to understand the kingdom. But all right. Lord, we thank You for this time that we have, and we thank You for helping us in our understanding of Your faithfulness to enact every one of Your promises, and that not one of them failed to Israel. You are a faithful God. Help us to learn that in our own lives and to trust You in every area. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Maybe my batteries are dying here.
Good morning.